Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. We are back after a bit of a hiatus, so thank you for your patience and hanging in there with us. I'm excited to bring you many more really fascinating interviews on our seventh season of the podcast. Today on the show, I have a very special guest. I have Nathalie Cooke. She is a professor of English at McGill University in Canada. And her publications focus on the evolution of culinary and literary tastes in both Canada and Europe. Her most recent book was actually published on my birthday on June 2nd of this year. And it's called Tastes and Traditions, A Journey Through Menu History. And it was released by Books in this year in 2025. So welcome, Nathalie, and thank you for coming onto the show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Well, first, I just want to say that one of the things I love so much about your book is just how beautiful it is and how fascinating it is to be able to look at these, images of these historic menus. And so I thought maybe we could start with a very simple introductory question of, why are menus important? Why do they matter?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And for ages, they were considered ephemera, the sorts of things that you would throw away because you only use them, to dine with. But the truth is, menus have an afterlife, right? That's longer than their life, if you see what I mean. And they're incredibly important documents because they give you an exact location. They give you usually an exact date. And they actually give you a sense of what foods were on offer and what people actually ate. And so, especially for this podcast, Foodie Pharmacology, you know that it's very difficult to find out what people actually eat because they self-report. They make it sound much more, better, more virtuous than what's actually happening.
Yeah, we're not going to tell you about the potato chips. Just, I had a salad for lunch.
Okay. Well, I remember that I was at a class at UCLA, and during breakfast, the lineup for the tater tots, I'd never heard of tater tots before, was extraordinary. Yeah. So menus give you essentially validation points for interesting moments in history.
That's great. Well, I think one thing I've noticed in my travels across the US and beyond is that it's not as common nowadays to have regionally specific menus. If I want to have a tomato salad in the dead of winter in New York City, I can order a tomato salad. But this wasn't always the case. I know that you cover menus that go back, a century or more. What can you tell us about the regional or seasonal aspects of some of these menus?
Well, I'm going to not duck the question, but I'm going to go a bit sideways on this.
Yes.
What it can actually tell us is the story of supply and demand.
Yes.
So things like mock turtle soup on a recipe, on a menu, tell us that turtles have become incredibly expensive and hard to access. But that turtle soup has become incredibly popular. So it becomes a kind of a status symbol to have turtle soup. And so hence, mock turtles. In my part of the world, which became secular essentially in the 1970s, there was a lot of overfishing of our fish and our eel in particular, because we were a Catholic province. And so we had a lot of fish or non-meat days. And so we had to look around to find enough seafood for that. And so menus will show this moment when the overfishing meant that those kinds of supplies were unavailable. So I'm answering your question, but a little bit sideways.
Oh, this is great because it reflects, what's happening with supply and demand, and also especially for wild foods, their availability for talking about fish and game.
But we do see local foods that need or require a local knowledge. So, for example, on Canadian menus, we'll see something like fiddleheads. which I think down in Georgia are probably not.
You don't typically find fiddleheads on the menu. These are the young fern shoot. No, we don't usually
Exactly.
do those.
And when they were first tried, the poor people who had stomach aches and who had some, essentially poisonous edible foods had to learn that they had to boil them 2 or 3 times before they were actually edible. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
You have to be careful if you're looking for fiddleheads that you get the right fern, because not every fern is edible.
That's a great point. It makes me think of traditional knowledge of foods, of wild foods in different locations. I just came back from visiting family in southern Italy and where my husband is from. And years ago, I did a lot of research in this region looking at wild foods. And there was a practice, very common, it's kind of like the poor people's food, right? It was wild harvested bitter greens. We know it in English as chicory, but the
Yeah.
scientific name is Chicoria mentivus. And so this was like a dish you would find in every granny's house, at mealtime. She would have this kind of lightly boiled and then fried bitter greens with some fava beans mashed up and maybe some crunchy chili peppers. And today, when I go to visit, especially people of my generation in the village, this is not anything remotely on offer at home when you come for a meal. They don't have these traditions. But I was very surprised and somewhat delighted to see it's now become a prestige food at local restaurants. And so I was able to have a heritage dish of, beautifully pureed fava beans topped with this wild harvested chicory is this very, gourmet, expensive, like 10
Yes.
euro kind of appetizer, which,
Right.
which was, that was the food of the people in the past. And those traditions have changed in the home, but found new life on a restaurant menu. And um,
Exactly.
little
And
hints. Yeah.
the other example that we can think of is dandelion. And,
Yes.
you can eat pretty much everything in a dandelion and the dandelion leaves, but we have to be so careful now because you want to make sure that you're picking your dandelions from somewhere that hasn't had weed and feed put on it, that
Yes.
hasn't come tainted.
Yeah. And dandelions are very similar in flavor, I find, to chicory because they're very bitter. I love to eat bitter greens. My kids, not so much. So, one of our favorite dishes at home are kind of just a bean and dandelion greens. Um, there's a local market that sells them even in Atlanta. So sometimes we grab them there. But yeah.
What a healthy meal. I mean, we know that now, right? That the
Yes.
beans and the bitter greens are ideal. And you could even add some edible flowers.
Absolutely. Well, this leads into the next question I had around, foods and perceptions of health. So, what do these menus? What story do they tell us about shifting dynamics in health traditions or perceptions of what's healthy? Did you find any interesting things around that concept in your research?
I found surprising things. So I think if you and I looked at menus for changing notions of health, we would be lucky enough to have some wonderful collections at our disposal. So we could look at the New York Academy of Medicine collection,
Mm,
which was actually collected by somebody who was interested in health. That was the reason these menus were collected. She wasn't a foodie. Um,
okay.
so I was expecting to see dramatic changes over time, right? And we certainly do see that. There's a wonderful example of a menu from George Washington chemists listing nutritious drinks. And one of those nutritious drinks is Coca-Cola, for example. And when it was originally marketed, it was marketed as an ideal brain tonic. And the truth is it was, because it had some pretty significant cocaine in that gave, quite a nice jolt, much better than
Cocaine, caffeine, all the great alkaloids there. I forgot.
the other one is obviously cigarettes. So we're
Mhm.
seeing, cigarettes on menus, whereas now we would not, well, first of all, they'd be banned in restaurants and we wouldn't see them. I was also seeing cigarettes on menus. There was a restaurant called Mother Goose's Pantry, and it was cool. It's a mimetic restaurant. So in other words, it's the building is shaped like the boot, right? So it actually mirrors. So it's very much, it looks like a kiddie restaurant, right? And you see kiddies lined up, and they are selling things like ice cream and things that kids would like to eat, but there are definitely cigarettes on the menu, which is surprising. Right? So that's what I was expecting. I was expecting to see more and more of that. And over time, if I were to write this book in 10, 20 years, I expect we'd see a lot less alcohol, for example.
More
Like
mocktails, maybe.
more mocktails, and probably mocktails with less sugar, right? Because that's one of the problems with mocktails. We're starting to move towards sophisticated juices, but they're really juices. There's Mother Goose's pantry. And I don't know if you can find a picture of the restaurant itself. It's on the next page.
For those of you that are listening to the audio version, if you're curious, you can pop over to our YouTube channel, the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel, where we have the full video version as well. And we're sharing some of these amazing images from Nathalie's book. And here we can see, yes, this incredible restaurant that's shaped like a shoe.
Shaped like a shoe. And if you look at the clientele, there are children there, right? I mean, it looks like a kiddie magnet, doesn't it, with Mother Goose up the top? But the menu itself is pretty adult. And here's where the surprise came in. That's not what I found. What I found was actually remarkable consistency over time in terms of what we understand to be healthy eating. And so probably the principle of moderation is the most obvious way that we're seeing that there was really an attempt to moderate the amount of food, to stay away from gluttony. Think of one of these original sins in a way, to keep it. And so I actually went and I looked at the Knights Templar. And, why were the Knights Templar able to live 30 or 40 years longer than their peers, barring getting assassinated, obviously, and killed out in battle. But they were living to about 60 or 65 at a time when their contemporaries were living to about 30, 35.
Oh, wow.
And they were following some very commonsensical notions of eating, that they had to eat in pairs. So they had somebody monitoring their intake, both to make sure they didn't eat too much and to make sure that they did eat. For example, that they weren't starving themselves. They ate relatively little meat. They did eat some red meat on the weekends. They drank alcohol in serious moderation. They controlled the amount of alcohol. And so a lot of the kinds of principles that we now think of as quite, healthy, including emphasis on vegetables and vegetables first, was something that we were seeing with the Knights Templar back in the 1400s.
Wow.
Yeah. And so
what's the oldest menu that you feature in the book? Or how far back were you able to go?
It's a cheat. I can show it to you. So it's a cheat because they date from 1757. And they are, if you see, they have services and they're handwritten. They're beautiful, beautiful menus. But they weren't needed as menus because at the time they were using something called French service, which ironically we probably know from, films or sketches of Henry VIII. These huge tables that are groaning because they have so much stuff on them because everything is out at once, right? That's actually French service.
Oh, okay.
So what they did was they put all of the foods out at once, and then they would actually probably remove the first course and bring something back. And in a course that's actually called the remove or the relevé, and they could do some entertaining in between. So these early menus from 1757 are from Louis XV, but they're fakes in a sense that nobody needed the menus. They must have been souvenirs for people who were, the very elite people who were sitting at the table. And probably the people who were worth their salt, right? Do you know that expression? Are you worth your salt?
Just salt, because salt was like a form of money. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was also the salt was at the table at a very particular place.
Oh,
So even though it looks as though you would have way too much food, you actually could only have the food that you could reach, right?
ah,
So the people in the best spots above their salt, worth their salt, would have access to the choicest dishes because they would be able to reach them. But the people down at the bottom of the table were not quite so lucky. And the people observing at the back probably got the leftovers the next day.
wow. Well, this brings up a question of, what is the role of choice in our current dining traditions? Right? Because the fact that we go to a restaurant and we have this long, and it takes, you have to go through, and sometimes you're in restaurants with many pages and it's just overwhelming sometimes. But that choice is a strange form of luxury, right? Or maybe how did you see kind of this emergence of choice as a luxury for the elites, or was this something that kind of happened across all classes in these menus? Why aren't we just all family service today, or fridge service? Why don't, when we go to a restaurant, why don't we just plop the food on the table? This is what you have
Yeah.
today. Take what you like. Um, what can we learn from menus about that shift?
Well, we identify Paris as the origin for the modern restaurant. So we think of it happening in about 1780, probably after the Revolution, when there were some chefs from royal households who suddenly were finding that they had to, re-engineer their career, right? And so at that point, there was a vogue for Russian service, which is what we have today, which means that the food was prepared in the kitchens and out of view, right? So in a way, the people at the table didn't have choice. They never had it before, but they only had choice when they actually had a list of things that they could choose from. And so the advantage was they were getting hotter food because it was coming direct from the kitchen, not lying around on the table forever. And they were actually getting what they wanted. So that was the luxury. So the luxury was not only choice, but it was also sitting at tables that were private, that were small tables and intimate. So the modern restaurant gave that luxury as well, something that we take for granted. The irony is today, if you think about some of the most extraordinary restaurants and the ones we'd all like to go to in Copenhagen, for example, those are tasting menus without choice, right? So the choice has suddenly
A lot
been,
of pressure off of you, and it's small portions.
but what it's done is it means that the choice is all to do with the chef. And so
Yeah.
the chef suddenly has that choice. The other one is I was fascinating with menus that are playful,
Mm.
that are puzzle menus. So there's a restaurant in Bangkok called Gagan, and its menu is all emojis, right? So what does an emoji of a palm tree mean you're going to be eating, for example, or a rainbow, right? So
That's
there's
incredible. It's
there is
incredible.
twice and pleasure, and it gives you a sense of the playfulness of the restaurant, but it's in a way it's taken the choice away from you, right? And I also, some of my favorites are riddle menus, and to a certain extent that takes choice away from you as well, because you have to be a very good riddler to get the answers.
That's great. Well, I'm thinking about differences in menus between different cultures. And um, as I mentioned, I was in Italy visiting family and going to restaurants there. There's not this sense of rush. Often it can take
Right.
some time for the meal to come out. And I think there are more fried foods that I do see appearing on even some of the traditional like menus there. It seems like a lot of the emphasis, at least in American cuisine, um, focuses on speed and having that hot food, which tends to be rather
Mhm.
unhealthy items, like a lot of fried foods or, quickly grilled meats, not the slow roast, not the, you know, um, I don't know, other dishes that take more time, like a nice paella or something. You don't find that as frequently. So what can you learn, or were you able to observe any shifts in that away from kind of more healthy or more nutritious dishes to this push toward more fatty or fried foods? Or did you notice anything like that over your analysis?
Um, my honest answer is I didn't look at a huge number of recent menus.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because my objective with this book, I'm an academic like you. So typically we have books that don't have a lot of pictures. But this book has 190 images, and most
Yes.
of them are in color. So what I was wanting was to grab people's attention with some of these beautiful menus and then tell them a story in about half a page that tells them something about the menu that they wouldn't obviously recognize, right? And so we're pretty familiar with contemporary menus. So I was, thinking I had collected menus from McDonald's from all over the world, let's say. So, what's the difference between a McDonald's in India and a McDonald's in the States and a McDonald's, you know? But ultimately, in order to tell stories that people were unfamiliar with, I wanted to surprise them. And so typically I didn't focus on the fried foods and the recent foods. I did focus a lot on unusual foods and unusual clubs, for example, that had menus. And so I tell some of those stories. One of the early menus I give is from 1870 Paris, from the restaurant Voisin, which is very well known, shows up in movies a lot, films. But and if you look at it, it looks like an elegant French menu with extraordinarily wines, of course. It's a Christmas menu, right? But then you look very closely at it, and the consommé is consommé d'éléphant, right? And so you think, why are they eating elephant soup? Or chat flanqué de rat, right? Which is cats surrounded by rats.
Oh.
Or one of these, exotic dishes in a French restaurant, right? And you wouldn't notice it if you don't look closely. So
Yeah.
at that point, I used that menu to talk about the siege of Paris. Now, Paris has been starving for 3 months.
Oh.
It's actually a royal menu. So it's the absolute elite who are essentially being allowed to eat the zoo at one of Paris's premier restaurants.
Wow.
The reason they have such wonderful wine is because, well, Paris, they had a good stock of wine. So even in siege, they have enough wine to last. But the other one is because it's French cuisine. They have this particular language and idiom, right? And so, there's one dish that uses kangaroo instead of lapin, and you realize it's because it's meant to be serving an animal that jumps, right? And the cats are surrounded by rats because there's an integrity to that pairing. You see what I mean?
They're chasing them around. That's incredible. Well, one thing I noted when I was going through the book, looking at some of the menus, was not all the menus have prices with the food. I don't know. I always go straight to the price. How much did it cost to get, a shrimp cocktail in 1913 or something like that? And so some of them have prices, but others don't. Like, oh, why is that? Why did some of these menus not show the price of the different items?
I'm proud of you going straight to that. You and I as women should absolutely be looking at the prices of menus, because for so long, women's menus didn't have prices, but the men's did, right? Because the man would be expected to order, to select what food and to pay. But as a courtesy, women were allowed to take a look at what was available so that they could perhaps discuss it. So that's one answer, that they don't have prices. The other thing is, because of the kinds of stories I was trying to tell, I quite often selected menus that weren't necessarily restaurant menus. They might have been menus from banquets or ceremonies. So there's a bar mitzvah menu, for example. You wouldn't be paying, right? You'd just be
That
looking,
makes sense. But this is
at foods.
a celebration that you're invited to. Okay.
Right. Or rather like a wedding menu.
Yes.
Or there's a wonderful Explorer Club menu, which shows a huge elephant, big red menu.
Oh,
And
here
then,
it is. A video
yeah,
of the big red elephant. Oh, the Explorer is the one on the plate. It looks like it
yeah,
has two.
exactly. Explorers Club menu, but and there again, that's an annual banquet. They still hold it. I mean, of all
It's
the
a
clubs
huge
to join.
fundraiser. I'm actually a fellow of the Explorers Club, but I've not made it to the banquet yet. So it's quite expensive to attend. So
Yes, but I mean that wonderful appetizer course, which is the exotics,
Mhm.
and they actually they're very careful about sustainable sourcing of the
Yes.
exotics now. Do go once.
I really, I had bought tickets the year that Jane Goodall was the
Oh,
speakers. I'm such, she's such a hero for me. And but then that was, I think, the year that COVID, everything was canceled because of COVID. So I missed out that year. Um, but it is interesting. I know I've seen they've had insects on the menu before and all kinds of interesting things.
yeah,
It's
that's right. But a lot of information about how they sourced and where they come from, and I mean, I like those menus because they go to the trouble of telling the story of the menu.
That's
That's
great.
why are menus important? You started that out, and it's because they tell detailed stories and they validate information with the details, right? And so we tell huge stories in terms of what foods we select to eat, what foods we prepare, and who we share our food with, right?
No, that's interesting. I really the access to knowledge piece is interesting too about the women's menu not having prices. That's fascinating. Um, okay, another question. I want to shift to art and when artists have signed menus. And what are the stories around that? I know that you noted well-known artists like Picasso and Toulouse-Lautrec
Yep.
signed their names to menus. What's the story there?
Well, it's at first it's very shocking, isn't it? These very famous artists are slumming it, and right, actually signing images on menus. So I think in the 21st century, I call us belated readers. I think as belated readers, we look at that and go, "Whoa, why are they slumming it?" But when you think back, it was a very practical thing to do. If they actually helped to illustrate a menu, they probably got pretty good food plan, depending on how good the restaurant was, right? First of all. Second of all, they actually got some pretty interesting publicity. Because if you sat down and you looked at a menu and you looked at this design or the image and you thought, "Ooh, that's interesting, isn't it?" You might be a very wealthy diner at a very wealthy restaurant, and you might actually become a patron of this artist. So it was a very logical thing to do. It was also just there was a fashion, especially in the 1920s or so, as printing technology had evolved. You could produce extraordinarily beautiful, highly colored images, and it was actually quite shocking how vivid they were. So think about theater playbills or theater posters with these wonderful colors, designed also by Toulouse-Lautrec and Picasso, who were really just exploring and experimenting with the technology that was evolving of the time, right? So would have been quite tempting for them to do that. We also have a number of commercial artists, people like Will Owen, who start to play with familiar characters, like the Artful Dodger. So, the film versions that were starting to come out, people liked them. And so we were seeing those kinds of illustrations on shipboard menus or menus during the golden age of travel, because it was a way of publicizing not only the film, but the artists, because these were wealthy people who were deciding to take advantage of, traveling by ship and by train.
That's amazing. It makes me think, what are we losing today with the shift to like QR code menus? I hate them. I really, I always like, I was like, no, I need a physical menu to hold. There's something different about a lot of people
Right.
have. with this. A lot of restaurants stuck with this digital menu. I'm like, oh, it's not the same experience. Yeah.
As a restaurateur, you can see why it's attractive, right? It's
Yes.
rather, it's like the takedown option, you know,
Mhm.
if you want to risk copyright. So they can change the menus cheaply. And I think the reason a lot of people hate it is we have to fight so hard to put down our phone, right? When we're at a dining establishment. You know, how often have you been to a restaurant and looked at the table beside you with two people looking at their phones instead of talking to each other, you know? But what the QR code does is it requires you to pick up your phone, which suddenly means the phone's on top of the table.
Yeah, it's right there. And then I'm just trying to scroll through it and understand it. No, it is interesting though how this also the format, as you mentioned, when it came to the ability to reproduce these in mass through printing technologies. And prior to that, I'm assuming they were hand crafted, right? The paper, everything. So to see this evolution in the oh gosh, in the
Chromolithography.
yes,
Yeah.
and then moving toward printing of different format. It's fascinating how it's changed over time. This must be so much fun when you find these interesting menus just to see, what were people doing in the 1800s or 1700s and what types of foods they would.
Well, it's just such a dramatic difference, from those early Parisian menus from 1780, which were essentially broadsheets
And
with tons of information in tiny fonts,
yeah,
endless, endless, endless details about the 37 kinds of vegetables you could order, that kind of thing. You know, um,
it's-
Also with some surprises in it, by the way. That story I tell, I pick out two or three things from the menu that shouldn't really be there. And that's the story I tell about that menu. But then when you take a look at what's been happening more recently and those, the die cut menus, these wonderful little menus that are uh, like fold up chairs, for example, or teepees, or three-dimensional menus that are really so striking and startling. Behind me on the shelf here, there's a wonderful book by a woman called Julie Ann Lambert, who is a curator at the Bodleian, which is, one of the most wonderful libraries, obviously, to go and look at. And so that was the John Johnson collection. And she ultimately explores the history of print in her two books, precisely for that reason, because that John Johnson collection shows this evolution from, relatively dull, you know, uh, two-toned printing to extraordinary die-cut chromolithography.
incredible,
Yeah.
fantastic. Well, we're at our end of our time for today. I want to thank you, Nathalie, for sharing this with us. And I want to encourage all of our listeners, if you're looking for a fun coffee table book that has beautiful, colorful reproductions of very interesting menus. I mean, who doesn't want to read about, cat surrounded by rat? or, or other really just fascinating stories. I mean, I think menus can be a window into our history across cultures. And I so enjoyed reading your book, Nathalie. So thank you for doing this. And just a reminder to listeners, support your local bookstores. You can order this through your local bookstores and get your own copy today. And again, it's called Tastes and Traditions, A Journey Through Menu History, published this year, 2025.
Thanks so much. And you know what? I think it it's cottage time out here to go and visit cottages. It would be a wonderful gift, for cottage weekend, or, a bread and butter gift. Just
Absolutely. And maybe you could recreate some of these recipes, maybe the less exotic ones, but it could be nice to kind of recreate your menu for a fun dinner party.
there are some tempting menus in here. It's not all cats and rats.
Yes, there are. No, I mean, I'm looking at one right now. It's the on board the El Presidente en route. I don't know if this is Pan American airplane
That's right.
menu. I have to say, it starts with a martini or a Manhattan or sherry. I mean, I like that kind of flight. You've got jus de tomates frappé. So I think that's frappe tomato juice somehow with
Yes, exactly.
olives. Hors d'oeuvres,
And
madeleine gelée, filet mignon. I don't typically get filet mignon on my airplane.
no, it's branched.
I just
There are also some puzzle menus in there.
ah,
The menus are just puzzles, like riddles.
fantastic. To see if
So
you
they're
can solve the puzzle. That's
exactly,
pretty
but it's also actually a good kit to throw your own puzzle dinner party. So they're used
fun.
to fundraising. Yeah.
Lots of great, really cool concepts and images here. So give it a look. And thanks again, Nathalie, for coming to the show. I'm so happy we got to chat today.
Thanks so much. And glad you had a wonderful break in Italy recently.
Yes, I was my chicoria and fava beans. Very tasty. All right, you've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. I want to thank you all for listening. And again, we are back in season 7. I took a couple of months off to keep our science lab going. So lots of grants written in that interim, but we are back and we have got some incredible guests coming up down the pipeline. So be sure to subscribe to the podcast. You can find it on any of your podcast streaming services. You can also catch it again on our YouTube channel, where I definitely suggest you check out this week's episode on YouTube, because you can see some of these incredible, beautiful menu images from Nathalie's book. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.